Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sonam Tandon, and on behalf of Google Mindfulness and Buddhist at Google Groups, I would like to welcome our two guests, Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro and Professor David Presti, to Google today. Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro, or Khenchen Rinpoche, has emerged as one of the most prominent Tibetan Buddhist scholars living today. He oversees the education of about 40,000 monks, nuns, and lay students at Larungar in eastern Tibet, which is perhaps the largest monastic community in the world. What I found fascinating was that more than half of those who come to study there are female Buddhist practitioners. Khenchen Rinpoche has also worked tirelessly to preserve Tibetan culture. He has started libraries and built schools. Khenpo is also a widely published author. His books range from commentaries on classic Buddhist philosophical texts to a book about inspiring advice to both monastic and lay audiences. I had the fortune of meeting Khenchen Rinpoche last year here at Google. At that time, we talked about developing Google Translate for the Tibetan language. I have a day job in finance, but I also moonlight as the unofficial in-house Tibetan translator whenever necessary. One of the challenges that Google Translate is facing is the lack of high-quality data. I discovered that Khenpo has co-authored several Tibetan Chinese English dictionaries that primarily focuses on building a collection of modern Tibetan terms. This is the first dictionary of its kind. So when we met with Khenpo last year, he had promised to provide us data, and today he has done so. So we are very grateful. Thank you. He is also well known for his compassion towards animals. He is a dominant ethical voice among the Buddhist religious teachers when it comes to promoting vegetarianism. He advocates a vegetarian diet and puts great effort into life-saving and the life release of animals procured to be killed. He sponsors annual summer life releases to save vast number of lives. Khenchen Rinpoche has rescued more than 100 million lives so far, and for that work, he is sometimes known as the Life Release Khenpo. Based on Buddhist values and ethical principles, he is establishing a vegetarianism movement, animal rights movement, which is extraordinary for someone from Tibet, where meat has historically been a main staple of the diet. Professor David Presti is a neurobiologist, psychologist, and cognitive scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since 1991. Between 1990 and 2000, he has worked as a clinical psychologist in the treatment of addiction and of post-traumatic stress disorder at the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center in San Francisco. He holds doctorates in molecular biology, biophysics, and clinical psychology. Since 2004, he has been teaching neuroscience to the Tibetan monks and nuns in India, part of a dialogue between science and religion initiated by the Dalai Lama. Professor Presti's expertise include human neurobiology and neurochemistry, the effects of drugs on the brain and the mind, the treatment of addiction, and the scientific study of mind and consciousness. Khenchen Rinpoche has for a long time had a great interest in modern science, including physics, biology, and neuroscience. In our world, there is often a divide between science and religion or spirituality, but rather than distancing himself from science, Khenchen Rinpoche has immersed himself in the study of science and often draws on science to help elucidate important Buddhist concepts, at times breathing new life into ancient Buddhist concepts. However, Khenchen Rinpoche also seems to be very well aware of the fact that science still has not understood everything, and in fact may still have some catching up to do with Buddhist science. So today we have to have a fruitful dialogue between these two great minds on the topic of Buddhism and science, and where this conversation between Buddhists and scientists is going, and what needs to be done in order to move this conversation forward. So without further ado, please welcome Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro and Professor David Presti. And I can't help but offer this traditional Tibetan welcome katas to both Professor Presti and Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro. Tashitale.
Okay, so given the Chinese-speaking audience here, I would like to give an introduction or welcome speech for Khenpo Rinpoche in Chinese. 四正罗珠堪布仁波切是当今世界上最了不起的高僧大德之一，具足佛菩萨一样的智慧和悲心。记得去年仁波切来到湾区，在斯坦福的教堂里做开示，我当时就有一个强烈的感觉，堪布仁波切来到美国，就像当年阿底峡尊者进入藏地一样。当年阿底峡尊者进入藏地的时候，其实印度和藏地都有很多高僧大德，还有了不起的成就者。但是唯有阿底峡尊者才能够把大乘佛法的根基，也就是菩提心以及修行的次第，真正在藏地建立起来。同样呢，我们看到，不管堪仁波切到哪里，都是把菩提心放在最重要的地位，反反复复的强调。所以呢，我这里也祈愿，凭借着堪布仁波切的智慧、悲心以及加持力，还有弟子们的信心，佛法的根基也能在西方扎扎实实的建立起来。最后，祝愿堪仁波切健康长寿，法轮常转，佛行事业广大，一切有情获得解脱。
Tini tsari bani riyak bozi chele ba tini tang nyambo tuli asa nangchu tang tini tsari ka parla tini kabdashi ya tini korpo shong rape gabo shong sonse.
Khenpo is very happy to have this chance to engage in a dialogue with such a expert scientist as yourself.
And I too am greatly honored to engage in this dialogue with a scholar such as yourself who also has a very strong interest in science and to making connections between the Buddhist tradition and the worldview and tradition of science.
Ne samna nga tso tsarita nangchu nikala tani nravi cha tani mambo zindagze tani nangchu tani koranga tani yang jimjik chikshye kando tsarika koranga jimjik shesa la jimjik shesa tere koranga nika jimjik shesa te madawa ndugda yina jimjik shilika tani tabshi da tani koranga tsadon da so 탐주본 라사페 몽본도 띠인디 띠니 가서 미 몽보스 그때네 차르글라 가서 가보시게요.
I'm of the view that there are many points of contact between Buddhism and science, even though they have their own respective topics or fields of research. There is much commonality between the two, for example, in terms of the methods they go about researching their respective topics of research and the principles that underpin the way they go about the research.
That also is my impression, and I feel that this conversation that has been happening in various different ways between Buddhism and science over the last several decades, I mean, it may go back even further, more than 100 years, but more robustly over the last several decades, has been a very healthy thing for introducing some innovative new ideas in science, and I hope a healthy thing also for Buddhism.
Is the main topic of our conversation today that of consciousness?
Is
it?
Yeah.
Could it be?
I hope so.
남시라 되니 짐직시야데 예상로 따라 가서 물라 짐직시 바레시 남시라 짐직시 바데 가서 물라 짐직시 바레시 데인디 남시라 짐직시 바데 코랑 짐직시 땅거 강디나 탑시 강디나 자 무삼나데 출루고 돈다서 장와서 말이삼고도 계산나 가리삼도
Khenpo is of the opinion that research into consciousness is research into humans, and whatever method we use to conduct this research, it is research that is not solely relevant to religious realms, but has a relevance beyond this.
I absolutely agree with that. I feel like investigations of consciousness are perhaps the most interesting question in all of science. There are many interesting questions, and because really consciousness is about who we are as humans and how we experience our connection with the rest of reality. And what could be more important and more interesting than that, than to try to better understand who we are and how we're connected with what we think reality is.
자르바 나라 미카시스 그제나 되니가 저 남시제야데 고음ben득지데 요 말이 요요 말이 고음ben득 되니가 저 춤조 그나니 파라이우잖아 되니 죽근득제니 되니 삼근득데 겨랑가니 삼근득.
Khenpo was heard that some scientists disregard the idea of consciousness and have even said that it's not necessary to have this word in the dictionary. What would your thoughts on this be?
That's a pretty extreme perspective. The truth is that all we know, everything that we experience, is by way of our awareness, is by way of our capacity to have what we're calling consciousness here, have a connection with what we're calling consciousness. So it really is all that we know. And anything that we conclude about the world is coming through this vehicle of our consciousness. So to dismiss it is not really a very tenable position, although it can often be dismissed as being something that is beyond our capacity to effectively study scientifically, that it's hard to design experiments that will really give us useful information on what consciousness is and where it comes from. And so therefore it's perhaps better to work on other things that may be more directly leading to some kind of new innovation or new measurable phenomena in nature or something like that.
Tene ngaso tata ngaso namshila tene ndeshija bine kamna ngaso laba tata tene ndeshija ko ngaso laba ngurchudin zene tene ndeshija ko yo je te ina netana tene korang ngaso tene laba chibo ndeshija na pena namshi ko tola yang ndeshija mathsa tene mambo yo sare pena ngi tindi zuru sonzete kyonte tatangani yo pena ngaso shiwa chungchung so tene korang ndepa korang dosa tene lamkha dosa te laba na la te korang chamba de jasa yorwa tene chamba jasa te mar mebashi ni tene korang chorta shini korang ngama dosa te na la te pando chundro te na la tene kapsa mi kungja o tindi na la ro shita ne kamna te korang ngama tene chamba jasa laba te mar javjana yo 다른 건조 신도제 메티리즘 통송 때 결합하다나 간지 때 양당바 제다 말이지.
Khenpo is started off by saying that currently among scientists the mind or consciousness is considered to exist in the brain or as a function of the brain, that consciousness or mind is explained as a brain process. But he's heard of an experiment where mice, laboratory mice, whose the memory component of their brain was removed. So previously they had been trained to find their way around a maze, and then the memory component of their brain was removed, and yet they still knew how to find their way around without having this component of their brain there. How would you, what would you think about this experiment? Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I would have, no, I don't know that experiment particularly, specifically. I know that there are experiments of that nature that suggest that whatever, if memory is in the brain, which is the conventional viewpoint in contemporary neuroscience, then it's going to be distributed in a way that it makes it very difficult to selectively remove some part of the brain or inactivate some part of the brain and be assured that you have erased every aspect of that memory. So it could be that that specific experiment may be addressable in that way. However, that being said, the question about where does mind come from, and how do mind and consciousness relate to brain physiology is a deeply mysterious thing. And although no one would argue that the brain is necessary, as the brain in our body and our nervous system and all of this is necessary for our experience of awareness as we understand it, it may not be the only way that that awareness can be maintained or be manifest in some way. That there may be aspects of what we're calling mind and consciousness that go beyond the body in ways that contemporary neuroscience has not even begun to address. And this is a very interesting area for future, hopefully present and future discussion.
Ngaso lapa tadi desi jamna pena nyangji ta dengmer ji pola ina tani nyangji ji ne kata tani khorang la dengmer yung ne kamni kala lapa tani olok no tiempo te parchindaw ga sere ina ngaso nyam yung ko thoning ti nyangji ta dengmer ni nyangji na la dengmer te dengmer ko choran daw te yona chok chok rete ina ngaso dengmer ta tani nyangji ni 카가 수수된도 딘디나 딘디가 같은 레시 잡나요 때도 레시 때도 rak반도 딘디진도 사르 기타나 간디도.
So, for example, with the experiences of suffering and compassion, scientists explain these as operating as the same kind of electrocurrent in the mind. And even though you could say that maybe compassion and suffering as feelings have maybe some similarities, in actual fact we understand them to be very different. So do you think that there would be another way of going about explaining this or researching this?
Well, from the perspective of contemporary neuroscience, the framework for which we currently have to understand experiential phenomena like compassion and suffering is by way of physiological processes in our body and in our brain. And so that the paradigm that's used in contemporary science is just to keep pushing that as far as we can go. And at this point, what's known about the neuroscience, the underlying physiological processes of emotions like suffering and compassion is very limited. And so everybody thinks we're only at the beginning of being able to better understand what's going on inside the brain and inside the body when these things happen. And those directions should certainly be pursued. What would also be interesting is whether you have other ideas about ways that could be investigated using the methods of science. And by the methods of science, I simply mean asking questions and looking for answers and trying to make sense of observations and looking for patterns, not being stuck in one particular theoretical way of describing something. Whether you have other ideas about how one might usefully investigate things like compassion and suffering, that might be helpful.
ngarang samlo tang bai na tarta chan ka tashi shelu ti ka te yaji ma sona pe khambo yo sari sam ko ti goni jimju she gona pachi jimju shelu yo samari sam dos yaji sona ta ko ro la serta so pe yaji sona chushina yuji.
Khenpo feels that if the current methods that are used to investigate emotions like suffering and compassion and not improved significantly, then it will be quite difficult for us to make advancements into this kind of research. However, if these methods were improved significantly, then it may be possible too.
Yeah. I would agree with that. What really interests me very much about the conversation that we're having and the larger conversation between science and Buddhism is ways that I feel like the most interesting thing for science is when we are forced to completely shift our paradigm in some way, our worldview, because of what we're observing. And this really has happened only a very small number of times over the entire history of science. Like, when people like Copernicus realized it's better to think of the Earth as not the center of the universe, that other things are configuring in a way that puts the Earth in the periphery somewhere. That led to a whole new revolution in science. And Einstein's ideas about relativity and quantum physics and evolution, these were big changes in the way that people thought about reality. And I'm thinking that we may be on the verge of similar big changes in the way of thinking about mind and consciousness, and that this conversation that is happening can bring in some really new ideas into the study of mind and consciousness that have not really been part of science as we've done it so far. And I'm wondering what you think of that.
실당 나랑 주 벤나 남시라 짐직시고나 영우부라 짐직시야 대여 짐직시나 대즈득사 말했어.
Khenpo feels that in order to contribute, if we're talking about contributing new ideas and new methods to a new paradigm shift in this way, that the ways we go about currently researching matter are probably not sufficient. Material matter.
Yeah. Tani bena ngaco tani zugina tani ngaco mukatana njukundukta ina tani jaina yang ngaco mukatatam kumend ngaco la navagunduks.
So, for example, if we are talking about images or visual information, we can see this with our eyes. However, sounds are not something we can see with our eyes. We need our ears to perceive these.
Shadangoni te nyoktamashina pe leslaborezite sem la jimjikshina korang la jimjikshina te yashute te re jambazkashiguna pe kambondus.
Khenpo feels that actually we don't need to make things so complicated. If we're talking about understanding the mind, probably using the mind to understand itself is the best way. What would you say about this?
I think that sounds pretty reasonable. The kind of place that science is at is that we have a set of methodologies and a paradigm that nobody can argue with. It works really well. Even Khenpos have iPhones. It's like everybody has a smartphone, everybody has a computer. These things came from the way that we study matter and understand matter. So, but is that enough to get us to the next level of insight about the nature of mind? I don't think so. And it'll only be part of the picture. And some of the ideas that you bring from your tradition and history, I think, will be very valuable for taking us to the next step.
tani tata tani ta tsarg ba tani namshila tani jawa japsar di toni jimjikshine te montani manjiti toni jona yargi chimbo yong to samares tani korang tani gartsam jina tupodi te ngaso samna namyo yo samares samdus pena ngaso di mukhur ba tola sarji garon janji tani gerwa shong ose gomi chi de yore tani kengur ba thola yore ke semkur ba thola chi chi mundu se te koran so zawi mangi ge tonin rolik de nord sam yore se aso samna.
Khenpo feels that the current methods that are used for researching the mind, if the idea is to proceed on this foundation and keep going with these kind of methods to research the mind, we're never going to get to a point where we have a paradigm breakthrough. So the paradigm breakthroughs that have been seen in biology or they've been seen in physics, that in terms of understanding the mind, say in psychology, that using the current methods are just not going to produce any kind of breakthrough.
Misamnanga tsumnu shokum sanye rupa nangla tsikchik yoris te fanshi yidong se kirchu gyawya koranga tapshi te tsawani kirchu gyawya tendiz yori te yona tani te tari te gartsam tubodian te yosaris sarkato.
Khenpo just agreed with what you said before, that essentially what we need is a complete paradigm shift in our approach to this in order to make a breakthrough about or in regards to researching and understanding the mind.
Google, being a place full of very inquisitive minds, certainly has a lot of opportunities for questions from the audience. And so to prepare for your talk, we've asked Google at large, all around the world, to submit questions. And we will also take some live questions from the audience as well. But as inquiring minds want to know, I thought maybe we could take this opportunity to move into this format. So the first question that we have here is, can artificial intelligence ever achieve sentience? If consciousness can enter a body, why not a machine?
Well, for me, that's an easy question to answer because it's an empirical question for the future, at least to start the answer. You can back off for a minute and say, we can never know anything about consciousness except for our own consciousness at some level. That the only thing I'm absolutely sure of is that I'm conscious, and the only thing you're sure of, perhaps, is you're conscious. And however, if we're willing to take for granted that maybe we can share a belief that we all have some kind of consciousness, then whether a machine can become conscious is a question for the future. Certainly, AI will continue to be more and more elaborated. We will certainly continue to have endlessly more intelligent machines. Whether they will ever develop any kind of awareness, if I had to bet one way or the other at this point, I would say no, because biology, I believe, is way more complicated than anything we're likely to build in even the distant future. I think a lot of questions about the likelihood of sentience in constructed systems underestimate the complexity of biology. Biology has been evolving on Earth for billions of years. Nervous systems and brains have been developing for hundreds of millions of years. The level of complexity inside a single cell is beyond our capacity to even grasp, let alone describe at this point. And so the idea that we're going to somehow map every cell in the brain and build a silicon replica of that, and it's going to have the capacity to upload consciousness into it and anything like that, it just ain't going to happen anytime soon, and maybe never. But it's an interesting empirical question, and we will continue to pursue that avenue, certainly. And so I'm excited to see where it takes us just in the next few decades, let alone thousands of years from now, if we continue to do this.
Tena ngarang girgung tini sambada tini samgado le la buzuk tina la yong thap samaris tini karte yong thapna maung bana chikshi na tarung nga chu chu samlo ta jamba chi ba de kan jina maung bana nga chu pen mi lipo ta jawa tinji chi ro thapsona tani mi jamba pen ngarang namshi tindina lan ro yin zeni tinji shine korang tini gom jamne tini gom nipala tindin rona chikshi na ro thap gores Tema to bajamba tarta computer the so nalan to samaris.
Khenpo also feels that this would probably be quite unlikely at the moment, or unlikely in the future, given that even though Buddhism regards the consciousness as something that is beyond the body, nevertheless, for it to exist on the base of another thing, such as for it to exist on the base of a human body or anything, for example, a flower, there are many infinitely complex conditions that would need to be in place for this to happen. However, one possibility he could imagine in the future is if a sufficiently sophisticated device were designed that could hook up a person to a computer, and through a process of meditation, a person were able to transfer their consciousness to the machine.
I like that. I was looking forward to your answer.
And Rinpoche has demonstrated his prescience for the next question. Similarly, has to do with the transference of consciousness or mind stream, not necessarily from human to machine, but the question is science doing anything at this point to understand the possibility of the mind stream coming into this life from a previous life, or incarnating from this life into the next life after death? Is anything happening in the scientific community to understand this question? And what is the understanding of this question from the Buddhist standpoint?
Within the scientific community, a little is being done, but very little. There are a small number of researchers around the world that are interested in trying to empirically document stories that small children spontaneously tell of detailed information of someone else's life. And some of those stories are very well documented and really check out to the extent that they can be investigated. There have been some very prominent researchers historically. Ian Stevenson, a professor at the University of Virginia, now deceased, and his protege, and now the leader of the research there in this area, Jim Tucker. So there is an attempt to really do good science around this, but it's a very small number of people, and it's mostly not known about. And to the extent that people have heard about it, they really don't know what to think of it. And primarily because we have no way to explain it. We have no way to account for this in our current biophysical understanding of the body and the mind and all of this. And I think this is one of the most interesting areas to pursue for the future, to look for things like this that we can't explain.
Tani tari Congo somba tata tani Virginia Lodro pe haliba tani jimji ga po shin de se tani ngarang chu ngarang ga pola tani jimji khaji shin yong se tani yin di so sama chigba ren de se te bu chung i bi kap se tani kharang ga pe na lo ni ta tani yin bi kap se tani jamba jimso jamba chiching me ni kharang ga ke nga ma lo ji ma po sha ya da tani kale yar chini lo dunda lo diak jini tini tsama kale jindro anda da to sun zambalang ga ma tsama ke nga ji tang ka sama chigba ren do tini chigba re yona tini tinalang ne tani chuni tini zin doze ma to te ka tis chig shosha ba na korang ga zin ti la ba na tini zambalang tsama chigba ren do mare tinalang ne tani korang ga na chuni tini dembazin doze te na nga zo tarin di Steven korang 시비네 그러나 그런 거 tsaka 치셔도지 그런 거잖아 그런 거 맞히시라 되니 이한테나 교파 치슈다 되니 조르지 그 사를 발라 그런 거 시킨 때마다 왔대 인생이 션도 대응군의 정례 삼로다나 저 식당 자리 받쳐오이나 식당 도점시네 그도보시네 짐죽시나 데디시나 데 약보지 제다 가시 돌아 삼로티즈 삼로 장드르즈고나 삼로 페테즈 갑시고사리스.
Khenpo has also paid attention to the research that's being done at UVA and in Tibet has himself conducted research into past and future lives. And what he found through his research was exactly the same as that which has been found in other research that has been undertaken. So, for example, young children of 2 years of age being able to tell stories of their past lives without any other prompting, and these recollections would endure to a period of when they were 8 or 9 years of age, and then slowly they would forget these things. And Khenpo says that this is the same all over the world, that this is how people recollect their past lives all over the world. They remember them when they're young, then they gradually forget the details, and the fact that this is observable and in many cases all over the world indicates that this is in fact a true phenomenon. It's a real phenomenon and it should be taken seriously. Khenpo notes that Professor Stevenson, that before he died, he said that one of his greatest regrets was that his research had not made an influence on mainstream science. Khenpo thinks that in general the very strict, rigorous approach that science takes to its research is good, it's appropriate, but there are some areas in which it could really do well to open its mind a little.
I agree completely.
I have a question mostly for David about cognitive scientists and neuroscientists who comment on this question in the public. A lot of them are telling us very forcefully and repeatedly that there is definitely no such thing as free will, and there's certainly no such thing as consciousness. My question for you is, how pervasive is this line of thinking among cognitive scientists? Please tell me they don't all think this.
I can assure you they don't all think that way, and I think it in part boils down to the difficulty with trying to design good experimental strategies to address these questions. You know, something like free will very quickly spirals into a convoluted morass of being hard to kind of know how to grasp this. Consciousness, I believe, is much more tenable, and I also believe that these are the kinds of things that motivate us to look for phenomena which are clearly relevant to things like consciousness, but that are currently outside of the explanatory framework. The previous thing that we just talked about in the sense of past life memories being an example of that. Because if that were to be better studied empirically, it would force us to expand the way we're trying to explain things, and it truly would be a paradigm shifting expansion of our understanding of reality, if that gets at what you're saying.
I thank you also for coming, and I have a two-part question. The first, mostly for David again. The first is, you alluded to some research that suggests, possibility of consciousness not originating from outside the brain, but possibly having some existence outside the brain. And I was wondering if you could indicate what research if I understood that correctly, what research you were alluding to there. And the second part is research that I don't know too much about this, but I've heard of research like Dr. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance, which I'm aware has been roundly discredited, but I've not found really solid discreditation. So I was wondering what you thought of that, if you're aware of that as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think those are excellent questions and comments, and it's important to appreciate that what we know from contemporary physical science and neuroscience is that our bodies and our brains and our nervous system are certainly necessary for our capacity to function in the world, including to be consciously aware. and that whether that's the whole story is completely unknown. It's an assumption. It's only an assumption that it is the whole story. And it's very much analogous to, the old image of, well, if all you have is a television and you're watching what's on the TV, then you just assume that it's all coming from that box. And of course, that's not even, of course the box is necessary for the construction of those images, but everything is coming from somewhere else. And there's no way we can say that that's not the case with us, that we're not simply some kind of receivers that are connected up with a larger matrix of interconnectivity that we don't have any capacity to investigate at this point. You can't, that hypothesis is consistent with everything we can say from our science. And so to entertain that as a working hypothesis is not at all unreasonable. In fact, it's very reasonable. And that is what really underlies things like morphic resonance and stuff like that, that there's some kind of profound interconnectivity that is linking things together in ways that we just don't have a grasp of yet. So I'm completely open to that. So at that point then, you want to say, okay, what kinds of empirical data can you find in support of that? And the past life stream stuff is certainly one aspect of that. If there's some way that information about one's being can get communicated after they die, then that suggests that something is going on that's beyond the body. Other kinds of phenomena that suggest some kind of interconnection between people over distances or time spaces that wouldn't normally be explicable. There's plenty of evidence that things like that happen, but it's not taken seriously by mainstream science. So those are things that I feel push us in the direction of needing to at least look at some kind of expanded way of describing things. I mean, I'm the first to admit I have no idea really what's going on. The only thing that I know is that we have a paradigm that works really well. It gives us, the internet and smartphones and all of that, but is it the whole story? Well, I doubt it. It's never been the case that our scientific way of describing things at some moment in time is somehow the whole story. I guess that's a lot to translate. Sorry about that.
lekata so mambozu te koranga dewa shita kore te di namshi le depi lile depi te namshi ni pata su chu na te halepa mambondus ta yena te ngaso chu na la yupi koati so te ni tsari pa ta pshinda poshini jimji shiguna tarti tsari pa ta dewa shiguna te kapo yo sare ma to shetan chu na la te mambore korang so la te di nyamnyum mi so la mamboyores.
In terms of, particularly in relation to past and future lives, within the realm of Buddhism, there is a great amount of evidence concerning this. So not just only the recollections and memories of people, but also in many cases people are able to prove they've got physical evidence of actions and activities that they have conducted in previous lives too. So from a Buddhist point of view, from a religious point of view, there is a lot of evidence. However, this is something that remains very difficult for science to research seriously using its current methods.
Terti so kana yona tini korang kewa shima tini len ti lenje rakyo nga chu mi jamba rakamare korang so lenger tini len ni tini te so ko so yi tola pap tini go mambo shini kewa nga shidam dira yo kan le ka mambo le
So, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, in the case of treasure revealers who discover treasures that were planted in previous lives, this is precisely the kind of activity that involves treasure revealers tapping into knowledge from previous lives. So this is one type of evidence that is regarded as valid from a religious point of view.
nga karti jiang ngap shi teni jimjuk te chama ga yakboz jimjuk shi ne yakboz hakko sona teni tinang la teni lipolin depi nam shi ga shi le mamboz tinang la jimjuk shi ji hore.
Khenpo feels that if the existence of past and future lives was able to be understood and therefore able to be accepted, that this would open up a great scope for doing further research into other aspects or other aspects of the mind existing beyond the body.
Teni pena ngatsu ngarang tso lama teni khong teni chakanani teni tedindi lengeres teni kharanga yam cho nani teni ted lengere teni so chama mi mambo ni kan thongres teni tedlen savi jini tinane khashina tinala teni show yore show go tola teni dai na fu ha to potendi yore teni ngarang gum kan thongnyos teni tela teni khocho yige mambo chom go yore so sama kiwa ngapshi gum jewa ta lipo lindi pi namshi gu shile tadagrese muni For
example, in terms of treasure revealing, Khenpo has seen with his own eyes, and not just himself, but many have seen with their own eyes. For example, Khenpo's own teacher actually go about revealing treasures, so recovering treasures from lakes and from other places as well, taking out vessels or items and opening them and finding within them pieces of paper on which symbols were written. And this kind of action is very much one that is based on a consciousness that transcends the body and connects past lifetimes to the present lifetime. So Khenpo feels that this is something, if properly investigated, would yield a lot of useful information.
Teni changmala nga cho laba chikbo nde shi jabna pe gotokbo resi te nde shi jab thamsa mare cheresina daru nga cho laba khwana yo chi ha ko yo mare si te magona teni nga cho di laba te la teni yo janzela namshi la nde shi jabna ta tele kyang khapore samdu.
Khenpo feels that a research methodology that relies primarily on researching the brain to understand consciousness is an extremely narrow and limited approach from the point of view that we still don't understand the brain. So if we're using an organ that we don't yet fully understand to understand this kind of thing, then it seems from the outset that it's quite limited.
Teni tela karizendo te inji oya teni te napshola mambo yongo de ne tindi makashila jimji shi nyong ara tindi makashila tumyongsi teni te sola samlo tana khosala nguni khosawo namshi te teni lile pat teni ndrondu teni lile par ndo lidang capture de par ndrondu ndrone yang ser yongo de lidang capture chawi jini teni khorang so yang xiao mambo nipa mambo sheken de te zengzeng mares te mambo teni
Another example is near-death experiences, which is something that Khenpo has also done a bit of research into as well, where people who have such an experience, their consciousness leaves their body for a period of time, and during the period that it has left the body does various things and is effective in various ways. This is something that there is quite clear, or there's a lot of evidence for, and that is possible to understand quite clearly.
Do
you think, what's your opinion about near-death experience? Do you think it is something that's true?
Yes, and I also believe that that is one of the other very powerful places where we can investigate empirically things that are happening with consciousness that are currently not explicable. If it can be empirically verified by what people are saying, that their awareness has left their body for a period of time and experienced this or that and then comes back, and then that's empirically verified. And there are people who are attempting to do that. Again, a very small number, and it's good science. It's just so hard to do these kinds of projects because scientists like to set up things that they can reproduce in some nice, neat way in a laboratory. You can't do that with a near-death experience. You know, they're very, they have their own agenda. I just want to say that I'm very optimistic about the future of this encounter between these traditions and where this might lead for expanded ways of appreciating the interconnectivity of all beings.
Khenpo also feels that for the future collaboration between Buddhist researchers and practitioners, in terms of collaborations between them and scientists, he also feels extremely optimistic about the potential here.